At Radio and TV Gallery, we'll hear from Senator Susan Collins of Maine, the chairman of the Senate Governmental Affairs Committee, the ranking member Joseph Collins of Connecticut. Several other senators and representatives gathered there as well. Live coverage on C-SPAN.
You can come on up. Where's that, on my knees? Yeah. What it's all going to look like. Very clear, right? This here. Right. Good morning. We wanted to get together to bring you up to date on the latest developments with the Intelligence Reform Committee. I'm here today with a bipartisan group of the Senate conferees and with Congresswoman Jane Harman, who has led the negotiators on the Democratic side, on the House side. Pete Hoekstra, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, would also be here, but for the fact that he's going over the bill in the House Republican caucus. But I think the outstanding bipartisan group that are behind me and with me today shows the commitment that all of us have to this landmark legislation. I'm pleased to report that every Republican Senate conferee and all but one of the Democratic Senate conferees has now signed what we believe to be the final version of the conference report. Really, it is the final version of the conference report. This legislation is going to make a real difference to the security of our country. It is going to improve the quality of intelligence provided to our military, and it will help to keep civilians safer here at home. It would not have been possible without the hard work and commitment of everyone here who worked so hard to bring this day about. We also have been blessed with an outstanding staff who have worked more hours than anyone humanly could have thought possible during the last 4.5 months. Now we are on the brink of enacting the most significant reforms of our intelligence community in more than 50 years. I'm really excited to have my colleagues here with us today, and I want to thank each of them for working so hard. This was an unusual conference because the members themselves were so involved in hammering out the agreements, negotiating the language, and making sure that we produced a good bill. And I'm very grateful for my colleagues' support. I'm also very grateful for the support of the 9/11 Commission. It was the Commission's recommendations that provide the impetus for this legislation. And this legislation is strongly backed by the 9/11 Commission. Finally, we will not be where we are today but for the support of the President. The President and the Vice President's interventions with House members were absolutely key in moving this bill forward, and I'm very grateful for the President's strong leadership in this regard. I'd now like to introduce the ranking member of the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee, Joe Lieberman. We have worked so closely during the last few months that we now can finish each other's sentences. It's been such a great pleasure to work with Joe Lieberman. He's an outstanding leader and a terrific friend.
Thank you. What's happening? I can't thank Susan Collins enough. She has set a standard for inclusive, thoroughly nonpartisan work on behalf of our national security. And I got to tell you that this is December 7th, 2004. There was another December 7th that was a day that someone said would live in infamy, and it has. Let's hope that this day, because of this agreement, will live in pride. It also happens to be significant for another reason. Are you ready, gang? It's Susan's birthday. Happy birthday. We have walked a long and winding road to get to this day, but ultimately we've gotten to exactly where we wanted to be, which is on the verge of adopting legislation that will reform America's intelligence assets so that to the best extent possible we can feel that we are ready to prevent another September 11th from happening. The 9/11 Commission, whose report is the basis of this legislation, was convened to investigate how 9/11 happened, to help us make sure we did everything possible to see to it that it never happened again, and to honor the memory of the 3,000 Americans who were killed senselessly, tragically that day. I think this bill will do exactly that. We create a strong director of national intelligence. Someone will be in charge of our national intelligence community in the broadest sense, overseeing the billions of dollars of American taxpayer money invested in intelligence in an age of terrorism. We're going to have a counterterrorism center that'll bring all the information, connect the dots so we can stop attacks against us before they happen. And there's a lot in this bill that hasn't been much talked about that I hope will receive attention in the days ahead. We do substantial work in improving our border security, our transportation security, information sharing, standardized driver's licenses, which will help eliminate fraud from the identification process. So we've got a lot to be proud about and a lot to feel good about, having made not only this legislation possible, but having showed the American people that when the nation's security is on the line, members of Congress can get together across party lines, work with the president to get something done that really will make our families and our children and their children safer in the years ahead. I thank all the conferees who all worked, just as Susan said, to bring us to this day. I thank our colleagues in the House, Jane Harman and Pete Hoekstra particularly. And Pete had probably the toughest job of all of us in many ways, but he worked very hard in a nonpartisan way to try to get us to where we are. And I got to come back to where I began. Susan Collins really deserves enormous credit for this accomplishment. I learned a lot about her in this process. This is someone who knows when to hold them and when to fold them. And I too often began to refer to her in Thatcherian terms as the lady with the iron fist and the velvet glove. She made a lot of things happen. I can't, at this moment of celebration, keep private this little anecdote from how this happened. Sunday night, I yielded and went to the Kennedy Center Honors. Susan was working on the bill, but this is the age of BlackBerries. And in the middle of Elton John, the tribute to Elton John, Billy Joel performing, she BlackBerried me the suggestion that we put in the word abrogate in this critical section about the powers of the DNI. I was pleased to BlackBerry back, yes, we should do it. And that apparently brought Mr. Hunter and Senator Warner on. So just think of what Webster and Clay could have done with Billy Joel and BlackBerries. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'd now like to call on Senator Trent Lott, the chairman of the Rules Committee. Let me just say this about Trent's role. When the going got tough in these negotiations, as it did repeatedly, I kept calling Trent to ask for advice. And he always gave me wonderful advice, intervened with some of his colleagues, former colleagues on the House side, and I'm very grateful for his support. Trent, thank you.
Thanks, Trent. Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. I'm so proud of you and Joe, Jane. She was so good in her comments on television the other day. I said, too good. But I'm delighted to be a part of this group and to have been a conferee and have worked with Susan and Joe and our colleagues on the other side of the aisle. I do think this is a monumental achievement. I think we underestimate what has occurred here. This is the biggest change in this area, as Susan said, in 50 years, and it really didn't get started until August. These senators and House members worked during August And to have moved from that point to actually getting this done is a tremendous achievement. And I just wanted to come by here and offer my support for what they have done. I think they came up with the right solution. To my colleagues in the House that had problems, I have to say I've known Duncan Hunter for many, many years. He's a great friend. He's a happy warrior. He's a tough warrior. And I know his heart was good in what he was concerned about. But he worked with Susan and Joe and Jane. Everybody worked together, and we came up with enough of a change to put his mind at rest when he thinks about his son, but to get this fundamental reform in place. When I went on the Intelligence Committee a year and a half ago, I'd watched Senator Graham comment, and I wasn't sure I quite understood what he was talking about. But as a member of the Intelligence Committee, I became alarmed at what I found. Who was in charge? How were the dots being connected? And the answer was nobody, and they weren't. This will be a huge step in the right direction. Will we still have to work on it through the intelligence authorization and working with the various committees like Armed Services? Yes. But I didn't think we could leave this session this year without this being completed. It's going to be, it is a huge achievement, and I want to give credit to all of my colleagues that are here, House and Senate, in a bipartisan, bicameral way. This is good for America. And when we can come together on an issue this important in a bipartisan basis between the two bodies, that's good, and I'm just delighted to be a part of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Brent.
Thank you
for what you said. I'd now like to ask the Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Senator Jay Rockefeller, to make some comments. There's been no stronger supporter of intelligence reform than Jay Rockefeller. He gave us several very useful recommendations which were incorporated into this bill, and I'm very grateful for his advice, insight, and support.
Thank you, Susan. Happy birthday. I think there's an interesting way of looking at this bill, which we hope and expect will pass. Back in 1998, George Tenet put out a declaration to the United States government that we were at war with Al-Qaeda. He was at that time the DCI. Nobody listened. The FBI and the CIA could not even exchange information, share information back then. We had to change that law after 1991. Now, let's just suppose that George Tenet had been, or somebody had been, the Director of National Intelligence, which is what this bill does. It elevates somebody to that position. Then I think it's quite probable, or at least there's a very good chance, that had the bill that we hope to pass this afternoon and tomorrow been in effect and had a chance to work through some of its obvious startup problems, that we might have had a chance not to go through the horrible experience that we did on September 11th. Why do I say that? Simply to say that those who think this bill is just another layer of bureaucracy or moving the boxes around or something of that sort are really wrong. This is a profoundly important bill. And one of the main reasons for it is that it will put an intense scrutiny from all of you, from all Americans, and from all of us in the Congress on what in fact happens as this new system evolves. And that in itself will alert everybody and make our job better. Now, in closing, I want to thank, obviously, Joe and Susan and Jane and Peter Huckström. But I just have to say that I just don't think there's anybody. Well, I've been in the Congress for 20 years, and I've never seen any person exercise the leadership, the restraint, the good humor, the toughness to stand up against whoever she had to stand up against than Susan Collins. I thought her leadership was almost unique in my time in this body. And I want that to be heard by all the people.
Thank you so much for such generous comments. It's now my great pleasure to call upon the former chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, Bob Graham. Bob, when we were first putting together this bill, spent a great deal of time giving us advice on what should be in it, and actually gave me an autographed copy of the book that he has written on intelligence matters. And I really appreciated that as well. So, Senator Graham.
Susan, thank you very much, and I hope you found the book informative.
I have. I did.
Joe commented about the irony that today is the 63rd anniversary of Pearl Harbor, which was not only a day that lives in infamy, but it also is a day that lives in the list of great intelligence failures of the United States. Today, after a half a century, we are committed and on the verge of making some fundamental reforms that will reduce the chances of another Pearl Harbor or another 9/11 occurring. I think there are many notable parts of this legislation, but let me mention three. One, while this chart emphasizes the position and influence of the new Director of National Intelligence, and some people have criticized the fact that we have overly centralized. It's my belief and experience that before you can intelligently decentralize, you first have to bring the disparate parts together. That essentially is what we've done. This bill also contains the seeds of the next phase, which will be a decentralization around threats and missions. The legislation contains specific direction to establish an intelligence center for counterterrorism and counterproliferation, and it authorizes the Director of National Intelligence to establish other intelligence centers as he or she determines to be appropriate. Second, at least equal to the importance of the organizational changes, is going to be the new emphasis on human intelligence. We came out of the Cold War with a withered human intelligence capability and a human intelligence capability that was largely focused on the Soviet Union. We knew a lot about Russian culture and history and languages. We knew almost nothing about culture, history, and languages of the Middle East and Central Asia. So we are now in a crash effort to restructure our human intelligence in a way that it can respond to the current threats. I think a case can be made that both the war in Afghanistan and the war in Iraq could have been avoided had we had more and better human intelligence capability. This legislation, particularly with its emphasis on linguistic skills, will go a significant way in that direction, as will a provision in the defense legislation which establishes an intelligence corollary to the military's ROTC, training young Americans who are interested in a career in intelligence. And finally, there is in this legislation a provision that Senator Lott and Senator Wyden and others were particularly active in, and that had to do with establishing a new process for classification and declassification of government information. Pat Moynihan said in his book, Secrecy, that secrecy is for losers. I agree with this, and I believe that our legislation will put us less in jeopardy of being a loser. Finally, I want to thank some people. I want to thank the people who participated in the effort by the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, which I was pleased that Vice Chairman Lee Hamilton of the 9/11 Commission said yesterday was the foundation for many of their recommendations. And I'd particularly like to recognize Porter Goss, Nancy Pelosi, and my colleague Dick Shelby for the outstanding service that they provided, showing that Congress can operate as a bicameral body. And the bipartisanship that has come out of this, particularly under the leadership of Senator Collins and Lieberman and Jane Harmon and Peter Hoekstra, is a premier example of what we ought to be doing in many other areas of difficult public policy. So I thank all the people who are here and their contributions to this effort. I think we're going to get a report card. We'll probably get an intermediate report card in about the year 2009, 5 years after this. We'll get a final report card on the 73rd anniversary of Pearl Harbor. I'm quite confident that it'll be a report card we'll be proud of.
Thank you. Thank you. Senator Norm Coleman completely upended his schedule today to be here at this press conference. And I mentioned that because it is typical of the commitment that he has made to this effort. Senator Coleman has attended every single one of the 8 hearings the Governmental Affairs Committee held starting back in July. He helped draft the bill. He's been involved every step of the way, and I'm very grateful for his hard work. Senator Coleman.
Thank you. Thank you, Susan. Thank you just for the opportunity to be part of this very important moment. I'll start, like everyone else has, and very appropriately, to thank the chair and the ranking member for their leadership. This has been an extraordinary effort. This was not easy. Not easy. And there are a lot of folks who doubted whether this moment would come. I actually told Susan I never doubted because I know Susan Collins and I got to know Joe Lieberman, and they were not going to let us. They're not going to let us fail. America could not afford to fail. We had to get this done. And with the support of the president, we're at this moment. 2 observations. One, this bill is not a rush to judgment. You have to understand the process. If Pat Roberts could be here, and he can't, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, played a very active role in this conference committee. He chronicled the many decades of intelligence reform ideas. There's a lot that's been on the table. In addition, we went through a process that me, as a former prosecutor, who understood what it took to do the investigation, prepare the case, and then deliver the argument. This was an amazing process. It was so rich and so deep and so thorough and so reflective in a short period of time. So we moved quickly, but no rush to judgment here. This was a very thoughtful reflection of what needed to be done, coming together in a bipartisan way, reaching across to in a bicameral way to come to this very significant moment. I think that's absolutely critical to understand. The second reflection is coming from a border community in a small state. So much of what we talk about, and the key stuff, most important stuff, is we'll have a director of national intelligence, and we'll have a national counterterrorism center. But we're also, in this bill, touching upon the needs of folks at the local level. Integrated communication systems so that first responders can actually communicate with each other, because God forbid we face another 9/11. It's the folks at the local level, not the folks at the federal government, who are going to be the first on the scene. We respond to that. There are things that we do here for border security, including reflecting on increasing the resources that go into border security and making kind of easier, by the way, some of the folks who live on the border kind of deal with the reality of their life. There are things in here that, beyond the big stuff, there are some little things here that in the end are absolutely critical to the security of this nation. And so in the end, I think this has been a magnificent effort with great leadership that has brought us to a very significant moment, and America will be safer today as a result of this bill being passed and signed.
Thank you. Senator Dick Durbin was the author of the critical information sharing provisions that are in this bill, as well as several other provisions. He was also someone who we brought into the conference negotiations from time to time because he has such expertise in so many areas. I'm very grateful for his hard work, and I look forward to hearing his comments.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again for your leadership. I think most Americans remember what happened after 9/11 on the steps of the United States Capitol. It was an historic moment. Members of Congress, Democrats and Republicans, stood on that fateful day and sang "God Bless America." I can't tell you how many people across America said, "Thank God You put partisanship aside at the time of national tragedy. That was a symbolic gesture, but an important symbolism. What is about to happen today with the passage of this legislation is in the same spirit. It is setting aside partisan concerns and really focusing on the needs of this nation. Intelligence is our first line of defense. And with this reform of our intelligence community, America's defense will be stronger against terrorism. That is the bottom line. We never would have reached this day were it not for the leadership of Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman. I came on the floor as this bill passed the Senate 96-2 and said to Susan Collins, this is why I ran for the United States Senate, in the hopes that I would be there at an historic moment when we would do something important for America, not just fight to a draw, not just have our press releases when it's over, but make a positive contribution to this nation and its future. And this bill did exactly that. A vote of 96-2 in the Senate, scores of amendments in the Government Affairs Committee, not a single one of them went down by partisan roll call. And I predict today you're going to see, or tomorrow, the similar bipartisan support for this when it comes to the floor. It could not have occurred were it not for Susan's leadership and Joe's partnership in this effort that really made it happen. There are two things in this bill of particular interest to me. One is information sharing. I thought to myself after 9/11, how could we have reached the point where the FBI, our premier law enforcement agency, had computers that had no access to the internet, did not have a means of transferring photographs over computers, they had to send them overnight express, basically had no word search at the FBI in the 21st century, and it was a fact. And as I started to explore this, I found that there was a huge bureaucracy protecting this inefficiency. Turf battles. Who's going to decide which computers go where? Well, we broke through those turf battles. And this legislation will establish an information sharing environment. So finally, the computers can speak to one another. And finally, we will have someone in charge of coordinating that sharing of information. That will make America safer. And the second thing that I worked on that I feel very strongly about is a Privacy and Civil Liberties Board, recommended by the 9/11 Commission. It's important for us to remember that protecting America is essential, but we shouldn't secure our safety at the price of our freedom. And I think this independent board will go a long way to protecting our individual freedoms. I'm proud to have been a small part of this and salute Susan Collins and Joe Lieberman for their leadership.
And last but certainly not least, I'm very pleased to call on Congresswoman Jane Harman. Representative Harman was there every step of the way. She brought great knowledge and background in intelligence and national security issues to the deliberations. And one of the pleasures of this conference committee was getting to know her well. So I'm very pleased that she's joined us today.
Thank you, Susan. Good morning. I'm here representing a majority of the minority. That's a new way to cut this pie in the House. And to thank my sister Susan and wish her the happiest of birthdays, and my brother Joe, who are the co-chairs of what we now call the Rock and Roll Caucus in the Senate, for an incredible effort and obviously a soon-to-be enormous success. I would just like to make comments about two people who are not here and two groups who are not here and who obviously share in what I believe will be this overwhelming vote today or tomorrow in both chambers. One of those people who is not here is Pete Hoekstra, who, as you all know, is the new chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. When the three of us planned a press conference on November 20, the day that we reached agreement, but sadly our bill was not scheduled for a vote in the House, we didn't expect Pete to be here because his caucus was resisting this bill, and yet he showed up. It was an enormous act of personal courage, and he has been, from day one, totally committed to this effort and to its bipartisanship. And to Pete, who is not in the room, who is right now in his caucus, wrestling with a minority of the majority, I say thank you for your partnership and good work. This success is owed in a substantial part to you. The other person who is not in the room is the President of the United States. Several people have mentioned him. Some people, including me, were not sure which side of this he was on in the early stages, or whether he might be on both sides of this. But it turned out in the later weeks that he and his White House staff were all over this and really helped bring this across the finish line. That was not an easy thing for him to do, but I listened carefully to his speech after his victory on November 2nd, and he said that in his second term, he was going to try to move the country together, and I think a very good way to begin that effort is to get the enormous bipartisan victory that we will, I hope, have today or tomorrow. It is a big deal to bring this Congress together, this Congress that has sadly been so polarized and I would say so dysfunctional. And this victory is a huge victory for bipartisanship. One of the groups that's not in the room is the 9/11 families. Maybe you're here and I don't see you. If you are here, please raise your hands. If you're not here, you are the moral force beneath our wings. And every one of us knows that we wouldn't be here if you had not done what you did to keep this issue alive, to make certain that the 9/11 Commission was formed, to make certain that it came together on a unanimous basis, to make certain that Congress listened, to make certain that we held our meetings, to make certain that the White House didn't waver, and finally to make certain, I believe, that we get the vote today or tomorrow. So you are a group without which we could have not have achieved this. And the final group that I want to mention, and I want to praise, and I want to say have my total support, are the hard-working women and men of the intelligence community, especially those who work abroad in austere places without the support of their family members, without even being able to tell their families what they do. I have always said that good people need better tools. Here come the tools to help good people succeed. If those people weren't out there, we would not have the successes that we now have around the world. We need more successes and fewer failures around the world, and I believe that those people in this new organization will be responsible for those successes, many of which none of us will ever be able to learn about. So my thanks and my full support, and I'm sure I speak for everybody here, to the hardworking women and men of the intelligence community. You're the folks we're doing this for, and the victories will be yours and the American people's. Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. Thank you for your patience and sitting through these remarks, but I did want to give each of my colleagues a chance to speak about this bill because they've each worked so hard. We'd be glad to answer any questions you might have.
Chairwoman Collins, you talked about the effort and the time in this. Jane Harman talked a lot about the moral force of the families, but is it not true that would this bill have gotten through were it not for this technical mistake that was made on the House of Representatives regarding the income tax provision? That's the only reason that the Congress is still in session right now?
No. Speaker Hastert on November 20th announced at that time that the Congress would return on the 6th and the 7th to deal with the intelligence reform bill. So I am confident that we were going to deal with this issue this month, one way or the other. I don't see it as having any link at all to the tax provisions that were stricken from the omnibus bill. Does anyone else want to?
No, you're absolutely right.
No.
This language that broke the stalemate, would this in any way impede the powers of the National Intelligence Director?
I'm glad you asked that question. The language that we put in would in no way weaken the authorities of the new Director of National Intelligence. All the language does is provide a little extra comfort to Congressman Hunter and others who shared his view that we were not in any way affecting the military chain of command. Joe Lieberman and I both serve on the Senate Armed Services Committee. We would never draft a legislation that in any way harmed our troops or interfered or lessened the flow of intelligence to them. And I think it's important to understand that the Commander-in-Chief, the President of the United States, in a time of war, called for passage of this important legislation, even before this extra language was added. I'm very pleased we were able to ease the concerns, the well-motivated concerns that Congressman Hunter had, and I think that the language that we put in satisfies his concerns without in any way weakening the bill.
Senator, why was it so difficult, though, to get the reassuring language after going back and forth? I know there were various exchanges of languages over the weekend. This sounds almost like a difference over semantics.
Joe, you want to answer that one?
Well, let me say a word on behalf of semantics. Words are important, substance is more important. And look, this bill creates a strong director of national intelligence and makes clear that the DNI has authority over the budgets of the national intelligence agencies, including the 3 that are in the Department of Defense. But there were obviously people on the House side who were concerned that somehow that would interfere with the chain of command in the military and would deprive our warfighters of the best intelligence. And we sought to do 2 things. One is to remind everybody that this bill preserves total Defense Department control over tactical military intelligence, the kind that the warfighters most depend on. Secondly, that there was nothing in the bill that would alter the existing chain of command, but we felt that reassurance was appropriate and would subtract not at all from the fundamental reform. And if you look at the paragraph that Susan and I presented, the concluding words from the Blackberries on Sunday night, the paragraph begins with a statement that, and I'm paraphrasing, of course, that the President shall issue regulations implementing this, which shall ensure the authority of the Director of National Intelligence with regard to budgetary matters. And then, as a reassurance, we say, but none of this shall abrogate the responsibilities of existing agencies. So I think we've, with a good use of semantics, we have preserved the substantial and critically necessary reform that the 9/11 Commission called for.
Senator Collins, the House provision that didn't end up in the bill on driver's licenses and illegal aliens, leaving aside the question of whether that belonged in this legislation or not, can you just speak briefly to the merits of that issue and whether you think there's any support in the Senate for taking that up in the future?
I think there is considerable support for overhauling our immigration laws and taking a look at the driver's license issue as well as other issues raised by Congressman Sensenbrenner. But the fact is that those provisions, which were highly controversial and several of them were opposed by the administration, would have been poison pills for this bill, regardless of their merits apart from this bill. And we just could not let the most significant reforms of our intelligence community in 50 years go down because of controversy over issues that were not recommended by the 9/11 Commission and were not central to the bill. I may well support many of the immigration reforms that Congressman Sensenbrenner has put forth when they're considered next year. I think the President had it right when he said that we should take up the issue of immigration reform next year and consider these issues in the context of an overhaul of our immigration laws. And I look forward to working with Mr. Sensenbrenner on such legislation next year.
May I just add something to that? As a House member, Jim Sensenbrenner chairs the House Judiciary Committee, and there's no question that he will be able to bring these issues up in the next Congress. I just wanted to point out a couple of things. First, there are significant immigration reforms in this bill, a number of them suggested by him and incorporated by the conferees. Among them are much tougher border protections, as has been mentioned, 10,000 more border guards over 5 years, 4,000 more border inspectors over 5 years, 40,000 more detention beds, new law enforcement provisions, including the lone wolf provision, and tougher punishment for terrorist hoaxes and material support to terrorists. These were controversial and tough things to add to the bill, but they were added in an effort to reach common ground with Chairman Sensenbrenner. With respect to driver's license specifically, the thing he is trying to do, which may or may not succeed in the next Congress, would not have prevented the 19 hijackers from boarding airplanes. They were all here legally, even though some of their visas had elapsed. They would have been able, because they weren't illegal immigrants, to get driver's licenses. But what we do have in this bill are two federal provisions that I think will be very helpful to the cause that he feels strongly about and most of us agree with, which is to bar people who are dangerous from boarding airplanes. We have a provision that TSA shall come up in 6 months with new standards for the ID documents that have to be used to board airplanes. We also have a provision that was in the Senate bill, which says that the states, which are always have traditionally issued driver's licenses, must meet basic federal standards for those licenses so that they are tamper-proof documents, which will again help prevent the wrong people from using them to board airplanes. So I think Chairman Sensenbrenner was pretty successful in this effort, and I hope that those who support some of his issues will be listening up here and consider strongly supporting this bill, which does contain a lot of important and useful immigration reforms.
One more question, please.
See if I follow up on something Senator Graham said. You said that you thought that this might be able to have avoided the Iraq War. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Well, first, I said I thought that had we had better human intelligence, that we might have avoided both the Afghanistan war and the Iraq war. First, in Afghanistan, we had inadequate human intelligence assigned to the task of locating Osama bin Laden and then detaining and killing him. Had we had superior human intelligence, I believe there was a reasonable chance that we would have accomplished that objective and therefore would have avoided the plot of 9/11 ever having been developed. Second, in the case of the Iraq War, the fundamental rationale for the war and specifically its preemptive quality was that we faced an imminent threat of weapons of mass destruction that required a preemptive response. The fact is, the intelligence agencies had identified 550 locations in Iraq where weapons of mass destruction were either being produced or stored. That information was based almost entirely on exiles, some of whom hadn't lived in Iraq for more than 20 years, and some foreign intelligence. We had zero U.S. human intelligence on the ground in Iraq in the months leading up to the war. Had we had such, possibly they would have gone to some of those 550 addresses, knocked on the door and opened it up and had an opportunity to personally observe whether the representations were true or not. So I think the case can be made that defects in our human intelligence contributed to the circumstances that led to both of those wars. And as I said, I'm very pleased that this legislation will recognize the importance of human intelligence and advance our capacity to provide the kind of people with the kind of skills prepared to carry out the kind of missions that are required today.
Senator Graham, I know you're going to be retiring here after 3 terms in office. Give me an idea. This is a very important bill. Obviously, all bills are important. But give me the sense of satisfaction as you leave office with this particular bill.
Well, the satisfaction is not a personal one. It's the fact that this is such a good example of what Congress should be doing on a regular basis. We shouldn't be lauding the exceptionality of the process. that led us to today. This ought to be the standard, and I hope that the example that's been set of bipartisanship within each of the two houses and then cooperation between the two houses will become the norm, and if so, not only will this bill have made a great contribution to improving our intelligence, it also will have made a great contribution to improving our lawmaking.
Can I simply add that Bob Graham made very significant contributions to this legislation. Without the work he's done in intelligence, this bill wouldn't have ended up as it did. And it's not only a great way, wonderfully constructive way to end the 108th session of Congress, it's an appropriately constructive way for Bob Graham's distinguished career in the United States Senate to end. So God bless you and Godspeed.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, Jay.
Isn't that what she said?
What's that?
That it's the end. Important part.
Something like that.
Talk about semantics.
Senator Graham? Senator Graham, get a couple of water boys.
You know what? I really hope it does. I'm sure.
I'll be back tomorrow.
Live news conference with a number of the conferees on the Intelligence Reorganization Bill. By the way, you can read both the House and Senate version of that bill online at cspan.org. In addition, we've also linked you to the letter that President Bush wrote recently to the conferees. That all's on the front page, the homepage of cspan.org. And for an update on House progress with that intelligence bill, we spoke a short while ago